whispers in the dark. New Orleans at midnight was a city of shadows and secrets. Beneath the veil of flickering gas lamps and the soft hum of jazz, the past whispered through the narrow streets of the French Quarter. It was a place where time seemed to fold in on itself, where the line between the living and the dead blurred under the weight of history. In the stillness of the night, something stirred within the old LaLaurie Mansion. Long abandoned, its decaying walls stood as a reminder of horrors that even the bravest dared not speak of aloud. The stories told of Madame Delphine LaLaurie, a beautiful and cruel Creole aristocrat who had entertained New Orleans' finest, but held a dark secret in the attic of her grand home. For decades, the mansion had been a place of dread, a relic haunted by the screams of those who had perished inside. But tonight, there was something different in the air. The wind carried with it the scent of burning sage, and on the cracked pavement below, a group of people gathered in a tight circle. They were descendants of the enslaved, of those wronged, of the souls trapped within the mansion. Led by a woman dressed in white, her face painted with intricate patterns of bones, they had come to summon the spirits of the past. They came to finish what history had left incomplete. At the center of this gathering was Daphne Antoinette. Her eyes, dark and steady, held the weight of centuries, and in her hands she cradled a small clay bowl filled with offerings, herbs, coins, and a lock of her own hair. Her face was painted in white and black, the markings carefully drawn to honor the spirits. She was a mambo, a priestess of Voodoo, and tonight she would finish what her ancestors had begun. Daphne had spent her life preparing for this moment, but her journey had started long before she could have understood its true meaning. Chapter 1. The Gilded Mask. The soft light of the New Orleans evening filtered through the grand windows of the LaLaurie Mansion, casting a warm glow on the finely decorated walls. In the parlor, Madame Delphine LaLaurie sat in front of a large gilded mirror, meticulously pinning her hair into place. Her reflection was that of a beautiful woman in her prime, her pale skin flawless, her eyes sharp, and her expression one of calculated grace. To the world outside, she was the epitome of refinement and elegance, an aristocrat in the highest standing of Creole society. She threw the most extravagant parties, frequented by New Orleans elite, who marveled at her wealth and power. But inside the walls of her mansion, an unimaginable darkness festered. A faint knock on the door interrupted her silent vanity. Her husband, Dr. Louis LaLaurie, entered the room. He was a tall, gaunt man with sunken eyes, as if the weight of what they did in secret had begun to devour him from the inside. "They've started whispering again, Delphine," he said, his voice low and strained. Delphine's eyes flicked toward him in the mirror, but she continued to smooth the strands of her hair without missing a beat. "Let them whisper," she said coldly. "No one in this city will dare confront us. They're all too afraid of what we might expose about their own sins." Louis shifted uneasily. "But what if they find out?" She turned then slowly, her dark eyes fixing him in place with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "They won't," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "Because those who cross us disappear, just like the rest." He nodded silently, defeated. He knew better than to question her. Delphine LaLaurie was not just any woman. She was power incarnate, a woman who ruled with cruelty masked by charm, whose whims could end lives. She had a sadistic appetite for pain and control, and the enslaved people she kept hidden in the attic of her mansion knew that better than anyone. Chapter 2. Daphne's Awakening. Long before Daphne Antoinette became a mambo, her life was shaped by forces beyond her understanding. As a child, she often accompanied her grandmother to the edge of the bayou, where the elders gathered to practice the sacred rites of voodoo. They would light candles, draw vives in the dirt, and call upon the spirits. Her grandmother, Maman Cécile, was known throughout New Orleans as a powerful mambo, revered for her connection to the loa, the spirits who could bridge the gap between the living and the dead. It was on one such night, deep in the bayou under a sky filled with stars, that Daphne first saw him, Papa Legba, the guardian of the crossroads. She had been only 8 years old, but she remembered it as if it had been yesterday. As the elders chanted, a wind stirred the trees, and the air grew thick with the scent of rum and tobacco. Daphne stood silently beside her grandmother, watching in awe as the flame from the candles flickered and danced. The air seemed to shimmer, and suddenly, there he was, a tall man, dressed in a sharp black suit, with a wide-brimmed hat. His eyes glinted with mischief, but there was something ancient in them, something that had seen the rise and fall of worlds. The elders froze as Papa Legba approached the circle, but it was Daphne he fixed his gaze on. "Ti man," he said softly, his voice like gravel and silk intertwined. "You have a fire in you." The others looked on in awe and fear, but Maman Cécile simply smiled, her eyes filled with pride. Daphne stood frozen, her heart pounding as Papa Legba extended his hand to her. "Do you know what I am?" he asked. Daphne shook her head. She could barely breathe. "I am the gatekeeper," he said. "I open the doors between worlds. I could give you power, little one. But for that, I must take something in return." Maman Cécile stiffened, her hand tightening on Daphne's shoulder. "She is too young," Cécile warned, her voice steady. "You cannot ask this of her." But Papa Legba smiled. "No, Gran Mambo, I ask for nothing. This one." He looked down at Daphne. "This one will serve the spirits with her own heart. I will take nothing from her. Except a smile. What a beautiful smile you have, my young one. A simple smile to warm my heart, and my power is yours." Maman Cécile was shocked, for she has never heard of Papa Legba, only asking for something so simple as a smile. She quickly looked at Daphne's and shook her head, yes, eager for such an amazing opportunity. With a tip of his hat, Papa Legba vanished into the night, leaving the wind to die and the candles to flicker once more. That night, Daphne had dreams of fire and voices, of spirits whispering to her from the other side. It wasn't fear she felt, though. It was something else entirely. Power. From that moment, her path was clear. Under her grandmother's careful guidance, she learned the sacred rites of voodoo. The spirits spoke to her in ways they did not speak to others, and as the years passed, she became a force unto herself. She felt Papa Legba's presence often, watching her from the shadows of the crossroads, but never asking anything of her. It was as though he had chosen her for something greater, something even she didn't fully understand. Chapter 3: The House of Horrors. Later that night, after the last guest had left the mansion and the city streets were quiet, Delphine ascended the narrow staircase to the attic. The air grew colder with each step, and the sound of muffled sobs and rattling chains grew louder. She paused at the top of the stairs and smiled, savoring the fear that radiated from the room beyond the door. These moments, alone with her projects, as she called them, brought her a kind of joy that no amount of wealth or social standing could provide. Delphine opened the door and stepped inside. The dim light from the oil lamps revealed the horror she had created. People bound in chains, their bodies broken and twisted, some of them unconscious from the pain, others too weak to even scream anymore. This was her domain, where she could act as God, deciding who lived, who suffered, and who died. "Look at you," she cooed as she approached a young man chained to the wall, his eyes wide with terror. He had been new to her household, brought in just weeks ago. She had already taken his voice, sewing his mouth shut after his screams had disturbed her. Now, his broken legs twisted unnaturally beneath him. "You should be grateful," she whispered, her voice venomous. "You serve me. I am your master, and I will do with you as I please." She reveled in their suffering, convinced that her status and privilege gave her the divine right to commit these atrocities. But there was something more beneath her cruelty, something far darker. It wasn't just power that drove her. It was a deep-seated madness, a thirst for control over life and death itself. What Delphine could never have predicted was that the spirits of those she tortured were watching her closely, waiting for their moment of revenge. Chapter 4. The Fire. It was the spring of 1834 when the fire began. Flames devoured the kitchen first, crawling up the walls and spreading to the rest of the house with terrifying speed. Neighbors rushed to help, horrified by the thick black smoke billowing from the grand mansion. Delphine and her family escaped, but when the townspeople entered to assist, they discovered the dark secret hidden in the attic. The enslaved people, tortured and mutilated beyond recognition, were found chained to the walls, some barely alive. The fire spread, consuming the house, but the LaLauries fled into the night. Madame LaLaurie escaped to France, leaving behind the legacy of her monstrous acts. But the fire wasn't the only thing that was set in motion that night. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. Nearly 2 centuries later, the LaLaurie Mansion stood as a symbol of death and suffering in New Orleans. It had passed through many hands, but no one stayed for long. Locals whispered of strange happenings, shadows moving through the windows, screams heard at night, and cold spots that seemed to cling to those who dared enter. In the heart of the French Quarter, Daphne Antoinette stood before the mansion, surrounded by those whose ancestors had once suffered at Delphine's hands. They had come here to finish what had begun generations ago. With the power of Voodoo, the spirits of the past would finally get their revenge. Daphne knelt, drawing the sacred vive in the dirt at the mansion's doorstep. The air grew thick with tension as she called upon Papa Legba, her voice steady and firm. "Papa Legba, ouvrez la porte," she chanted. The gatekeeper appeared as he had all those years ago, his form towering and shadowy under the moonlight. "I am ready," Daphne said, her voice strong. "I have learned. I have served. It is time for justice." Papa Legba smiled, tipping his hat once more. "The door is open, Timanman. Do what you must." The spirits of the enslaved rose from the shadows, their cries filling the air. The walls of the LaLaurie Mansion trembled as Delphine's restless soul was dragged from the depths, her screams of terror echoing through the night. This time, there would be no escape. Daphne's eyes glinted with the fire of her ancestors as the portal to the underworld opened beneath Delphine's feet. "Justice!" Daphne whispered.